Good evening. As you can see, I'm still young. There's a well-known Chinese, either curse or blessing, depending on how you look at it. May you live in interesting times. We do. These times are extraordinary in the shift in emphasis in just about everything people believe. There's a great confusion because of that. And so the interesting times also bring us to doubting whether there are any values and so on. This book of mine, Hope for a Better World, which just came out officially, that is, we got the first copies tonight. So you're fortunate to have, I hope it's going to be fortunate for you, to have this book. I'm quite enthusiastic about it, and I do urge you to look at it. It is an analysis of the last few centuries, the evolution of thought in the West from a time when we had it all pretty well together. The world was the center of the universe. Each country was sort of the only country that existed. In Hakluyt's Voyages in the 1500s, he wrote about parts that had not yet been discovered, which is just about everywhere in the world, and it said, "Here be griffins." They didn't have any idea of what the world was like. A word for a lie in those days was, that's a Marco Polo, because Marco Polo went from Italy to China, and he discovered a civilization that just couldn't be. I mean, it just, everything he brought back was just mythical and absurd. It took them some time for enough people to go to China and discover that indeed there was something happening over there. And when he went to India, he made a very interesting observation. He said that this is surely the most prosperous country in the world. Interesting, because not very long afterwards, it became very poor. And you saw England went to India and suddenly became rich. India became poor. You suspect there was some sort of a seesaw going on there. When all the jewels in the dome of the Taj Mahal suddenly disappeared and were replaced by glass, for example, makes you wonder a bit. We did not realize that they too have a right to their civilization. They have a right to their way of thinking. They have a right to be considered on a par with us. But there's been great confusion in the last few centuries. Marco Polo was a part of that. So also was Copernicus, who discovered that the world is not the center of the universe. He thought the sun is. And do you know that scientists, astronomers, physicists believed that the sun was the center of the universe until pretty late into the 1900s. Unbelievable when you see how very different things are as we now realize them to be. A little square inch of space taken through the Hubble telescope reveals millions of galaxies, each galaxy containing some 200 billion stars. When I was a child, and that was long ago, back in 1930-something, when I was in school in England, a professor told me with awe in his voice, he said, do you realize that they've discovered, Hubble had found, that the nebula in Andromeda was actually a galaxy, a whole star system, island universes as they were called in those days. And he said, do you realize that we're not all the stars that we see are just one galaxy, and that there are even 2 or possibly 3 other galaxies? Wow! I mean, now we know that there are at least 200 billion galaxies in the universe. In fact, who's counting? It's just too big even to think about. But when Copernicus even discovered that the world is not the center of the universe, already people began to question their values. If we're not the center of the universe, then what are we? We thought God had made the universe for man. Man was at the center of everything. Man was ultimately and supremely important, and suddenly he's reduced to just a satellite around something else. And so people began to question. In fact, It was a big trauma in religion, not necessarily so. It wasn't something that Jesus taught, that the world is the center of the universe, but people took him literally. He spoke about the four corners of the world, and they figured sort of a square chessboard or something, I suppose. At any rate, they found that it was round. That was the discovery of Christopher Columbus, but it was known long time ago. The Greeks knew that the world was round. The ancient Hindus knew that the world is round. In the ancient Indian scriptures, they described the universe as like the motes in a sunbeam. There are as many stars and star systems in existence. We just didn't know because we'd gone into a period of sort of decline where everything was sort of small and parceled out, and our understanding was such that people in one village would think of people in a village on the other side of that same mountain as strangers, foreigners almost. Well, how far we've come from then, where we suddenly discover, I know back in the 19th century, somebody was, I spoke about the 1900s earlier, I meant the 19th century, that they discovered the fact that the sun is not the center of the universe. But in the 19th century, a very prominent scientist said, if I can't have a model of it, I can't accept it. Well, the universe as we know it now just is not acceptable in his terms. Light, they discovered, was both a particle and a wave. They discovered, Einstein found, I think it was, in 1905, that matter is really only a vibration of energy. This chair that you're sitting on is not solid at all. It's got much more space in it than solid matter. Why doesn't your body sink through it? Differences of vibration, it's just all it is. Science has given us an incredible universe, which now I think many scientists have gone sort of, as the expression is, hog wild with this thing, and they're postulating all sorts of different universe. Maybe there's another universe in which Hitler did win, and so on. I think that's pretty much poppycock. But nonetheless, we do see a system that is not rational in our terms. We can't make sense of it in those terms. As a result, what's happened is that people's sense of values has been greatly undermined. People have come to feel that there are no moral values, really. Everything's relative. Einstein, when he said everything was relative, what he was pointing out is that everything's related to everything else. It's a really different thing. Philosophers think too much. And so they've just assumed that the world is such that, well, if the certain tribes in Africa think that it's a sign of weakness to be kind, then they have as much right to think that as anyone else. That if a tribe of gypsies in Tuscany in Italy consider that it's really a sign of lack of truthfulness not to be able to lie cleverly, you tell me how anybody can put that one together, but that's what they believe. You just have to say, according to modern trying to be rational thinking, well, they have a right to their opinion. One of the worst, most horrible photographs I've ever seen was of a group of cannibals exulting over a corpse. And yes, they were all laughing gleefully, but it was not the sort of scene that you would see in an Italian restaurant where they're glorying over a plate of pasta. There was something evil in their look. There's something in man that does not accept certain actions. And this is something that we need to begin to understand, that human nature is such that there are moral values are actually rooted in human nature. Human nature is rooted in nature. And there is a truth underlying it. But these things take a little time to understand. We are now living in a period of extraordinary confusion for the simple reason that people don't know what is right and what is wrong. And you see that young people think they can do anything and get away with it. Sartre wrote a book called Saint Genet, about this man who was a male prostitute and a thief. And he called him a saint because he was absolutely true to his own values. Well, that's a preposterous statement, a preposterous belief, false also, but he tried to demonstrate that there's no such thing as objective truth. Well, in my book, Out of the Labyrinth, I ask a simple question. If values are relative, can I eat nails just because I believe in eating nails? No. Why? Because I have to live with my body the way it's made. And the same thing is true for our values. And you can see it all around you. All you have to do is look at people and how they live. People who think only selfishly, their energy is going inward. And when their energy implodes upon themselves, you do not see radiance, you do not see happiness, you do not see those things which everybody wants. Because everybody in the world wants basically only two things: to avoid pain, I think you can all agree with that, to find happiness. And I don't see how we can disagree with that. All of us want happiness. Some people may define it as pasta, others as curry, others as lots of money, others as lots of power, lots of different definitions, but basically we want happiness. Now, what we see in the world is that some people find it and some people don't. Why? Because there are principles involved and they're universal. That when your consciousness expands, when you think of others, you're not depriving yourself. You're expanding your own awareness, and there's something in life that wants self-expansion. That's why we want power, knowledge, experience, all these things. They're only an extension, a projection of a desire within ourselves to expand our consciousness. Now, if you take it the other way and contract it, you'll notice that all people who think me, 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 they're not happy. There's a thing I remember from Howard Hughes. About the last week of his life, somebody got a hold of him on the telephone, a reporter, and he asked him if he was happy. Here he was, possibly the richest man in the world. Nah, I'm not happy. He had all the money. It made him miserable. You know, there are actually more suicides among millionaires than there are among paupers. Why? Because having found that pot at the end of the rainbow, you find it's filled with fool's gold. And there are a lot of false quests in life. But when you reach the end of those quests, you see that it's not just a matter of opinion. You see that always, if they've taken it into selfishness, grabbing for themselves, if their energy has gone in the wrong direction, then what you find is disillusionment. And so you see that life is set up to teach you a few basic lessons, but those lessons are all rooted in the need to understand who we are, why we are, where we need to go. You will see a very interesting fact indeed, that in all the different walks of life, writers, businessmen, pioneers, adventurers, pirates, criminals, whatever they might be, you will see that none of them will tell you, after they've reached their goal, none of them will tell you, yes, this is what I'm looking for. Oh yeah, they may say it for a year or two. Then they may spend another year or two trying to convince their friends that they've got it. By the time they reach old age, nah, can't say I'm happy. It's a sad commentary on the stupidity of human nature, that they will keep on going in the wrong direction. But the wonderful commentary on the nature of this universe is that people gradually are finding, and this is what I was going to say, that there's one class of people who, when they reach the goal that they're looking for, they all say, this is it. Now, you can't find that among writers. You can't find that among millionaires. You can't find that in any walk of life. But those people who seek truth, those people who seek it in a devotional way, in a spiritual way, those people who find God. I don't mean cardinals. A lot of cardinals are nothing but businessmen. I mean saints. I mean real saints. People who pass their lives in love with God. You will never find one who says, yeah, I've got there and what a scam. You find, on the contrary, that they're willing even to sacrifice their lives to help other people to find the same thing. They're willing to give up everything to help others to find it because they know that it is what everybody is looking for. You're looking for joy, yes. You're looking for an escape from sorrow, yes. These other things give you lots of sorrow. You don't find anything but sorrow at the end of any path that you look at. In this, you find an escape from sorrow. Even when things don't go well, you didn't see Jesus on the cross weeping and grieving for himself. All those who have, there's a beautiful story of a saint. He was called Haridas. He lived in Orissa in Puri in India. He was born a Muslim, but he became a devotee of Krishna, who was a Hindu avatar, a Hindu master. And as a devotee of Krishna, the king of that state of Orissa was absolutely outraged because this Muslim became a Hindu. And he called him in front of the court, ordered him to become a Muslim again. He said, I can't. Finally, he told him he had only one choice, either convert or be executed. He said, then you have to execute me because this is the truth. I have found it. And so they hung him up by his thumbs to a tree, and they had a group of executioners beating him to death with cudgels. And there was a crowd of people all watching this execution. And Haridas, up there, suffering, obviously, physically, he prayed only one thing: may everybody here in this great crowd experience the joy that I have found. And that crowd of people began dancing. They were so filled with joy that they couldn't do anything else. And they were all dancing and singing the name of Krishna. And the executioners finally just had to drop their cudgels. And they too were dancing in joy. This is what we all want. I don't say we want to be beaten to death. I do say that whatever happens to us, we want to reach the point where it can't touch us. It just doesn't matter anymore. Because we know that there's something that is ours forever. That is the goal that everybody's looking for. We're looking for something that will not be fleeting, that will last, that we'll be conscious of, that we'll never get tired of. That's why Yogananda said the best possible definition of God is not omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, or the Western theologians' way of the cosmic ground of being. All these things are just dry. They don't mean anything. But he said a valid definition of God is bliss. And this everybody's looking for. Ever conscious, ever existing, ever new bliss. This is the goal of life. But boy, are we a long way from understanding that today. I read a book not long ago, about a year ago, in fact. I was at East West, our secondhand bookstore in Mountain View. And I found there a book called Books That Changed the World. And it was an interesting book. I read it, and I thought, well, it was about the authors who really have shaped modern civilization. And I saw that each one of them, very intelligent, geniuses possibly, they have shaped our present outlook on life. And I saw that in every case, they just didn't have it together. A very basic question they didn't ask was, does it work? How more basic can you get than that? But what they offered did not work. Plato wrote a book that is still being discussed in university classes. And it was The Republic. And he proposed a society that if you study his treatise, you'll have to say, this is grotesque. He was talking about, okay, the real aristocrats, the real leaders should not marry. They should just copulate with anybody they choose, some leadership. They should open their doors. Nobody should have a private home. Everybody should be free to come in and go out. They should have the children should not know who their parents were. They should all be recognized as children of the state. He said this before Karl Marx. Parents shouldn't know who their children were because they shouldn't have that attachment. And mind you, this is the most ridiculous part of it all. You have to know who these great leaders are going to be from their qualities that they manifest, presumably in the crib. Generosity, open-mindedness, willingness to think of others, not of themselves, and so on. I mean, let's see, how unreal can you be? The payoff of his whole theory was this, that the king of Syracuse invited him to create a community like what he had envisioned. He did. It was a complete fiasco. It didn't work. And still they discuss it in university classes. Why in God's name, I don't know. If a thing works, is the time to start being interested in it. That didn't work. But none of those people really did work. It's all theory. When Copernicus discovered that man is not the center of the universe, it created a huge revolution in thinking, which is still going on right now. And yet, if you look at these things, and this is what I did with each one of those writers, I stepped back and I said, wait a minute, what are you really talking about? You haven't reduced man to nothing. What you've said that there isn't a center anywhere. Nobody knows that there's a center in the universe. I suppose if they ever found one, it still would be meaningless to us. You are the center of the universe, each one of you, each one of us. Center everywhere, circumference nowhere is an ancient concept. And as science has said, the atom is the key to the whole universe. When William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood back in, what was it, I forget right now, but back in those days, people didn't even know how the blood was pumped through the body. That's how ignorant they were so recently. Doctors in student doctors in medical school, they don't need 1,000 cadavers. All they need is one. One person, one cadaver, one body exemplifies the entire human race. What is true for you is true for me. Maybe true in a different way, but the only way you can really understand anybody is to the extent that you've understood yourself. You cannot understand people by just making notes. You can understand them by going deep into your own motivations, because all of us are basically the same. So what Copernicus did really was say, man needs to get back to himself. He didn't say this himself, but that's what you can gain from his discovery. The church was, of course, very upset because it meant that they lost hegemony and all power over people was sort of being taken from them. But the truth is that we are the center of everything. Each one of us will never understand anything except to the extent that we begin where we are, and from that point, expand our knowledge, expand our understanding. How do we understand the people in China? Because we're the same. They're not different from us. Not very long ago, you couldn't help thinking that people were completely different. The more people travel now, the more they realize that basically our tastes are not that different. We all want food. There's nobody who says, well, I choose not to live with food. We have certain basic needs, we have certain basic tastes, and we recognize those things in each other. Now, all these writers in modern centuries, and think who they were. Well, there was a very interesting one who came along in Italy, Machiavelli, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli gave us a whole system. He wrote a book called Il Principe, the Prince. And in this book, he was telling rulers how to gain and keep control over people. And the way is to be absolutely ruthless, absolutely cynical. Don't hesitate to torture, kill, murder, doesn't matter. You have one responsibility, and that is to maintain control. Well, a lot of people have followed it. The question, however, does it work, applies here. Because indeed, it doesn't work. All those people who followed his, and some of them considered him their Bible. Hitler kept a copy of The Prince by his bedside. Napoleon had it in his carriage at Waterloo. Mussolini said it was the greatest treatise for leaders and rulers until he realized that people would understand his secret, and then he banned it from the libraries. But again and again, you'll find that the people who followed his principles, yes, they succeeded for a while. They all went down in flames in the end. When you go against truth, you cannot win in the end. So what happened was that people have come to understand the principles of leadership in a very wrong way. Now, I've written books on the subject of leadership because it's something I've had a certain amount of experience in. I've been the leader of communities and many different things. And I've discovered that leadership has to be cooperative. You can only lead people to the extent that they're willing to be led. You can only lead them to the extent that they're willing to go along with it. You need, and the good thing about reading Machiavelli is this, that it shows you how not to lead, how not to rule. Again and again we see the same idea happening, that certain things they said, they weren't fools, they were very brilliant people. But certain things they said while they worked, there was something not quite right. An example was Adam Smith. He wrote a book on the wealth of nations, very well-known book. He talked about a principle which I think basically we in America do accept, which is free enterprise is essential. If you're going to have an economy that flourishes, you've got to give people a chance to flourish. You can't just control everybody. Seems fairly self-evident. He took it a certain distance, but he didn't take it quite far enough. He said, imagine a baker. He's not in the business of baking in order to help you. He's in the business to make money for himself, to support his family. People, when he wrote that, were absolutely outraged. What about Christian generosity? What about thinking of other people? And what about all these moral values that we're teaching all those poor benighted heathens in Africa and so on? But he was simply teaching the truth. Nobody's going to do anything if it doesn't do something for himself. Would Jesus have allowed himself to be crucified on the cross if he had known that he would be displeasing God and damned for eternity? No, obviously not. Everybody thinks first of finding fulfillment for himself. So let's take, at least Adam Smith brought us one example. Let us take that example a little bit more down to earth. Let's imagine a town in which there are 2 bakers. This is an example I gave in my book, Hope for a Better World. And one of these bakers, let's just call him William Baker. And he's a true disciple of Adam Smith. And so William Baker is only thinking of what he can get out of his customers. And he sort of snarls at them when they came in. He's sort of like a woman that I met in Taormina in Sicily 2 or 3 years ago. And I said, I was thinking of buying a hat. And I said, well, which hat do your customers like? And she said, I never care about what they like. I just, they pay me and they leave, and that's all I'm interested in. I said, that's not a very happy way to live. I said, you have to spend 8 hours a day in your shop. Why not enjoy it? Why not get to know your customers a little bit? And so anyway, I left her. She was a sourpuss. And I came back the next day, and she greeted me with this big smile. She still had a crusty look about her, but she'd understood. I guess I had gotten her thinking a little bit. And then later on, They gave us a bottle of wine in the hotel because we'd been there before, and because I don't drink wine, I took this bottle to her thinking this might help her. And you know, she absolutely wept. People want this, but they always are afraid that they're going to be looked down on, treated badly, and so on. Like one time I opened a door in New York City and somebody bumped against it, and I said, "Excuse me, I didn't see you." "Why don't you look where you're going?" Well, you can't be happy living like that. That's just a simple fact. And so here we have William Baker getting ulcers. Yeah, he sells a few things, but supposing in that same town, there's another baker whose name, let's call him Joe Crumpet. And Joe Crumpet is a very different kind of guy. He likes his customers. He welcomes them. He's sure he's in the business for the same reason he has to make a living. But at the same time, he finds happiness in having friends instead of enemies. And so he welcomes people, asks them, "Well, did you like this? Would you like me to make something different?" He inquires about their families. He says, "Well, how's your daughter this morning?" And all these things that people have in normal human communication. Now, think of yourself as simply a customer in that town. To whom will you go? Joe Crumpet, obviously. Because it's just human nature. You're not in life just to get, you're in life to give and receive. And this makes the beauty of life. So Adam Smith was mistaken. In fact, there's a mathematician who has proved mathematically, far beyond me, but my problem with math was that in college, the math classes were at 8:30, too early. However, this scientist, this mathematician, showed mathematically that cooperation is much more effective than competition. We've been raised on this concept of competition, but look at it. This is the way Yogananda put it too. You have a town, let's say, of 1,000 people, and each one is competing with everybody else. Each person has 999 enemies. Wouldn't it be a lot nicer if each person had 999 friends? Now, you know, thoughts like this are interesting, intriguing, but people will come back at you with, "Yeah, but it's a dog-eat-dog world. Nice guys finished last. You have to always get yours." And you can't disprove it by just nice statements. You can't say, "Well, I'm happier." "Yeah, you're happier because of this and that and the other." There's one way you can prove it. And this is what I'm here to talk about today. You know, Karl Marx, when he started communism, well, he didn't do it himself, but he got the ideas launched. And so the communists in Russia finally did it. How were they able to convince everybody to accept this system? Perfectly simple. Kill them if they didn't. You know, the Chinese and the Russians are estimated as being responsible for killing 100 million of their own people. They're so-called comrades. As the movie Ninochka has it, when Ninochka comes from Russia and talks about the latest purge, there will be fewer but better Russians. Is this the way to make changes? It's the way people think. Look at what they did in Cambodia. They killed about 25% of their own people. Ridiculous thing. Why not a perfectly obvious solution? When, in the early years of this century, Orville and Wilbur Wright launched a plane at Kitty Hawk, they were doing something that experts in the field had all said, they were all agreed it was not possible. You can't make a heavier than air object fly. They made it fly. Well, it didn't happen immediately, the revolution of air flying, but it did happen from then on. It usually takes about a generation for a new idea to really take hold. But nowadays, you wouldn't think of going in the old way of covered wagon to New York. And probably you wouldn't even bother to go by train. You'd take a plane. Now, why? Not because some government stood there and ordered you to go by plane. You found that it made sense, it's simple, it's easy, why not? What you need is examples. Now, when I was 15, I had this intuition, insight, inspiration, whatever you want to call it, communities. It was something I really wanted to do, and I was so enthusiastic about it myself that I got lots of my friends interested until they saw I was serious, and then they all dropped out. But I was really quite serious myself, and I studied many different books on the subject. I studied many different communities that have been started, many different civilizations, and tried to think about it. I saw that if a few people can live together, they can be much closer to all mankind than if they're just skating around. You can't feel that closeness with a big city. Everybody's too sort of tied up in himself. I remember a very sort of sad, in a way, an evening that I was invited to in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where we were invited to sit at the hostess's in her garden outside, and she wanted me to sing some of my songs. And she said, all these guests are interested, so they'd love to have you. Well, I played. Well, you know, people in New York, and this is very near to New York, they're always afraid of somebody snarling at them or putting them down. So there tends to be a difficulty about expressing enthusiasm. Well, they didn't express enthusiasm. They were looking at the ground, they were looking at the sky, they were looking here, they were looking there. Nobody looking at me. And I thought, well, gee, I don't want to impose my music on anybody. On the other hand, I want to be a good guest, and my hostess has asked me to sing, so I sang one more song. And I figured, well, I'd done my duty, and I said, well, shall we eat now? And there was a stampede for the table. Well, you know, you just assume when people react like that they don't like your music, right? I can't imagine a different reaction. It didn't matter to me. But here's the payoff. I was with what seemed to be the sort of leader of that group in the car the next day. He was driving me somewhere. And I asked him, well, how did you like my music? I was sort of curious. It's all right, I guess. Sure, okay, well, fine. However, here's the payoff. He said, in fact, I have a cassette of it, and I play it every day when I go to work. That meant he loved it. How could he have such a reaction if he loved the music? And presumably, if he was sort of the ringleader, or whatever you want to call it, spokesman for that group, presumably what my hostess had said was true. They did want to hear it. Why couldn't they say so? Why this fear of saying, I like it? Why this fear of saying to a perfect stranger, I like you? Because there's always the fear that he'll snarl back and stab you in one way or another, verbally or whatever. And so you find that in big cities there is sort of a protection that people build up around themselves. They become cynical just as in self-defense. It isn't they're cynical necessarily by nature, although I think that certain towns do manage to create impressions of certain things. For example, a friend of a cousin of mine in New York, they were talking about the violence that some people experience. She said, oh, I don't know why they talk about New York as being so violent. He said, I've lived in this town all my life. He said, I've only been mugged 3 times. Well, that's 3 times more than I have traveling all over the world. But you know what's actually possible? You can hear all these people like Leo de Rocher saying that nice guys finish last. You can hear all these philosophies that it's a dog-eat-dog world and that you've got to get ahead and beat the other guy down and so on. You can hear it all. And you can say, well, it doesn't seem true, but you can't prove it. However, if a group of people can get together and live together in harmony, and there isn't all that squabbling that you'd expect, then you begin to see, well, maybe something is possible. And so this was my ideal. And you know, when I came to Paramhansa Yogananda in 48, that's a little bit of time ago. I was very excited to find out that that was his ideal too. In fact, his organization has tried to push under the carpet his enthusiasm for it, but I can tell you I was there. Every talk that he gave in public, he would detour to talk about communities. There's something that somebody sent me from an old magazine of theirs in which he was talking about wanting to create a world brotherhood village in India. He was very enthusiastic about it. They don't believe in it, but I somehow always did. I was recognizing in what he said a truth that I felt deeply myself. And so there was this real rapport there. He gave a talk in Beverly Hills. This was in about 49, 50, I don't know for sure. Most inspiring talk I've ever heard. And he was really, it was a garden party. You know, when you go to a garden party and you're asked to speak at a garden party, you'd expect somebody to say, well, thank you, my hostess, and thank you, my host, and how nice to have you all here, and I hope you're having a good time, and that the kiddies are getting enough lemonade, and a few little things like that. Wow, he only talked the way God inspired him to talk. And did God ever inspire him to talk? He was talking about communities. He said thousands of people must go north, south, east, west, everywhere. I never was so inspired in my life. And I swore I would do my best to fulfill that concept. I was the only person there, hundreds of people. But one person's all you need. One person with enough determination. And he fired me with that. Well, I was able to start Ananda. And in the beginning, everybody told me it wouldn't work, and I'd certainly fail. I used to marvel that they'd even say it. I said, you don't do things to succeed. You do things because you've got to do them. If you really feel that you've got to do it, you do it. And you don't worry about if it's going to work or not. I believed it would work, but if it didn't work, I still had to do it. And yet, so many people were telling me it can't be done. And yet, however, just like Yogananda talking to a crowd of people, one person answered. And so, in crowds of people that I talked to in Sacramento, San Francisco, Palo Alto, everywhere, one person here, one person there, they began to get interested. And they came. And I didn't have any money. I had nobody sponsoring me. Nobody believed what I wanted to do. So I had to earn it. But I earned it by giving lectures and classes, and I didn't charge much, $25 for 6 weeks of classes. That's peanuts. Even then it wasn't much. But it was enough, and lots of people came, and I had maybe 300 students a week, and that gradually gave us the money to be able to to buy the land, to build the first buildings. And so people came bit by bit. They began to say, well, gee, this is a great thing. And over the years, mind you, we're 34 years old now. That's long enough to get some idea of whether it's going to work or not. Ananda is a wonderful experiment. People come from all over the world. We have a whole group of students from Taiwan coming to a youth camp this summer, from India to this youth camp. We have people coming from everywhere. Now I live in Italy, and most of my lectures, all my lectures there are in Italian. But people come there too. We have them again all from all over the world. South Africa, Australia, Asia, America, South America, everywhere in their thousands. Why? Because the word is going out. Something's happening. Now, what is happening is this. And I think we've been there long enough to be able to make this statement very strongly. It works. You know, if you had a group of people, let's say the people of Ananda were to go around the country, each one to live in a separate town. Each one had a job. Each one had a responsibility. Each one had a position, whatever it might be, but lived in the suburbs, but nobody was in touch with anyone else of our community. They would be an inspiration in the sense that they would be calm. When people were fighting in the office, they would be calm. Even our children in school, when they go on to college or go to high school because they want another kind of education. The one thing that they're noted for now is how well behaved they are. They're centered in themselves. They have something that the other children don't have. And here in Sacramento, we've seen again and again children who have been there even just in our school for a few months. In their new school that they're in, they're always given the lead part in a play. They're leaders in the community. Why? Well, they could say, these people in their individual offices, yeah, it's because I meditate. People wouldn't accept that. They'd say, this one lone person, he probably eats bran for breakfast. Or they'd say, okay, it's because he's a very special guy or a very special gal. But they wouldn't be able to say that what he's doing is something I can do too. When you get those people together, this is the power of community. You see that there's an example happening. Somebody came to me a few years ago, he said, you've got some wonderful people here. I said, you know, if you met one or two people like this, you could say, yes, they're wonderful. When you see many people like this, you have to say it's what they're doing that's wonderful. Because people come, and this is even true for people who just come as guests, and they come with their city worries and tensions and so on. You can see in a matter of a few days, those tensions leave. There's a shining in their eyes, a smile on their lips. Very different attitude from what they've come with. The environment changes them. What they do changes them. People become very different. You know, a wonderful thing about a community is that it's a laboratory. You see people living together in different ways because, yes, we have certain precepts and so on, but we don't tell people they've got to do it. That would be straitjacketing them. That's no fun. That's no fair, and it's not realistic. It's sort of like Procrustes with his bed. Theseus came there back in the ancient Greek and Grecian days and found this man. He was a monster. And he always had this special bed for his guests. And if they were too short for the bed, he would strap them down and stretch their bodies, laughing while they died in agony. And if they were too long for the bed, he'd slice off their legs and let them die and bleed to death. And so Theseus, fortunately, was strong enough and was able to kill this monster. But it's a perfect symbol, perfect allegory for trying to impose logic on reality. And that's what it's really all about. You can't, in a community, say you've got to do this. People are people, and that's the greatest defect in all sociology and social thinking today. They try to fit people into different categories. People are simply going to be people. However, in a community like this, where we do have certain principles, certain things that we urge people to do. We don't have any rules. We have only 2 rules, basically, apart from no dogs and no drugs. No dogs because dogs tended to chase the deer. No drugs, well, because it doesn't work either. But 2 rules. 1, people are more important than things. So that if, for example, you've got something that really needs doing, but nobody wants to do it, it'll wait. People's needs are more important. Secondly, where there is truth, there is victory. Where there is adherence to right action, there is victory. And we've adhered to that. An example was, back in 1976, we had a forest fire. 450 acres were destroyed. 21 out of 20 homes in that area were destroyed. We had no insurance. It got a few other houses in the area, but Ananda suffered the most. Well, of course, it was a heavy test for us. Our neighbors phoned us a few weeks later with great excitement. They said, it's been discovered that the cause of the fire was a faulty spark arrestor on a county vehicle. We can sue and get our money back. And I feel suing is a dirty way to make a living. And I wrote to the supervisors, I said, I know you're worried because Ananda was the biggest loser. I said, I want you to know we're not going to sue. We'll just take our bad luck out on ourselves. And people thought we were crazy. But 10 years later, those neighbors were still lamenting over the loss that they had suffered. One day later, we were joyfully rebuilding. And somehow, people all did pitch in to help us. We did receive donations. Somehow we hung in there, and we flourished as a result of that. Every test we've undergone has been a great cause of growth, a great blessing, in disguise often, but definitely a blessing. Yes, when you think in terms of principle, you do come out ahead. That goes counter to 99% of the literature today. But we've been around long enough to, I think, say it does work. And the thing is that you see this community, that even in the midst of that devastation, I mean, you see a forest fire of 450 acres, that's a lot of acres. We had about 700, I think, at that time. It was a large part of our property. You look at all those black trees and you think, what a disaster. In very few years, it grew up more beautiful than ever. If you can hang in there, here's another reason for having communities, for working together cooperatively. Our health food store in Nevada City was called Earth Song. Burned down. Some coffee pot wasn't working, destroyed the whole shop. Yes, it was gutted, it was still standing, but completely destroyed inwardly. Took us many months to rebuild. The average business would have simply closed its doors. It couldn't have handled it. Because we're a community, we have a broad base. We were able to keep things going long enough to be able to rebuild and make it happen. When you have a broad base, you have an entirely different social structure. A couple at Ananda get married. Everybody pitches in with pocket money to help them go to Hawaii on a honeymoon. Everybody pitches in to help them get settled nicely. Somebody goes to the hospital, very ill. Well, when in this world, when people go, relatives come, friends come, not that many. At Ananda, it's just amazing. There was one woman dying of cancer. She just said cheerfully, I'm just not a chemo kind of gal. She refused to take chemotherapy, and she was dying, and she was in the hospital. Those nurses and doctors were absolutely flabbergasted. She was so cheerful. I was in Italy. I phoned her. She was just 2 days away, I think it was, from dying, just happy. The room was full of members of Ananda, complete support, emotional. All the nurses were just moved by it. This kind of thing you don't see in the world. There was a story, a true story, of a couple who were leaving their apartment in an apartment building in a big city. And they had their bags out in front of their door. A couple from upstairs saw the bags there. They said, oh, you're moving in. Oh, just welcome. We're all about one big family in this apartment house. Welcome. They'd been living in that apartment for 2 years and had never met. That's the level of sort of party, good fellowship. One time, Roosevelt, just to sort of test this cocktail party scene, went around at the cocktail party telling everybody, I just killed my mother. Oh, you don't say so. How interesting. We'll have to talk about it sometime. Or, well, my dear fellow, very interesting, but, we've all got our problems. Or nobody answered relevantly because nobody even heard him. This is how too much of life is. It's a cocktail party. People meet, they smile. Americans are great at smiling, but how many people are there with you when you weep? How many people are there really to help you? Fortunately, America is very different in this respect. That is a wonderful thing about America. I don't think I could have built Ananda in another country. This is a great country that way. When the earthquake in San Francisco happened, neighbors did help one another. That's not so common. When a group of us went to Moscow, I wasn't with them, but Davy and others were there. The one thing, they had to put them in a sort of a government youth hostel or whatever it was, and they weren't allowed to do it, but they did. And so the people said, the one thing you just have to remember, don't smile. They'll immediately know if you smile that you're an American. All the people there, they think they're being sincere. Well, this is true here, but it's not true enough. You still have people in great suffering and great need they don't have the friends they need. There's a great loneliness. In the cities, loneliness is perhaps the greatest disease. People don't have good friends. Yes, they have people to laugh with at cocktail parties. They don't have people to weep with. Not very many. Ananda is a way of life that, honestly, I think it's not only the most sane thing to do, the only sane thing to do. Get together with other people. I don't say join Ananda. You know, in this book, I recommend communities with great strength and conviction. I don't name Ananda once. Why not, for heaven's sake? I do say that I've started communities, but I make the point, I'm not trying to win people to a particular example of communities. I'm trying to get the concept across. You can start communities in all kinds of different ways. More power to you. I would find it a terrible burden if everybody wanted to join Ananda. For God's sake, what would we do with them all? Or if we had communities of Ananda everywhere. I wouldn't want that. If people really want it, okay, but I wouldn't want to control it. Once you get that kind of controlling thing forced even upon you, you don't get freedom, you don't get spontaneity, you don't get joy. Everything should begin from a small core, from the beginning, from a small group of people, from the heart of things outward. That's how life grows. You have people starting, let's say, making a statue. Pygmalion made a statue of a beautiful woman, so beautiful, they say in the mythology, that he fell in love with it and prayed to the goddess Aphrodite, who gave life to this statue, and so they lived. And you're led to believe happily ever afterwards. Yogananda would smile and say, yeah, with rolling pins and black eyes, but never mind. The thing is that man can't produce life. Man can do all sorts of wonderful things. He can't do things in a living way. Why? Because he does everything from outside in. You know, a nylon thread doesn't have a hole through the center. Doesn't need it. There's no life force to flow through it. You cut any plant fiber, you'll see that there's life flowing through that thing. There's a hole there for it to flow. Everything in this world that's alive begins from the center out. The embryo begins with just the little sperm and ovum uniting and gradually multiplying, but always from a center outward, and we think from the outside in. We'll never get it that way. We have to realize that life is center everywhere. You are the center of the universe, each one of us is. God sees things that way. That's the reality. If we can understand this with communities too, then control of a community is not so important. Let each person be responsible for his own life and just sort of help to guide the flow of traffic. You don't have to boss people. You'll find that the more, if you start communities yourself, the more you give each individual, empower them, give them the authority to do things in their own way, and just say, well, no, we don't murder people here, or no, we don't go against. There's certain principles you can encourage. You can certainly say that certain things don't work. But you'll find that there's a spirit that people capture that would make them automatically want to live in that way. We don't tell people, be happy. We make them want to be happy. We give them examples. This is the wonderful thing. I was talking about the example of the laboratory of Ananda. In Ananda, where you have hundreds of people living, not just in the village, here in Sacramento, in Palo Alto, in Seattle, in Portland, in Assisi, another one starting in Rhode Island. Yeah, we have quite a few hundreds of people. But you find that with those hundreds, not everybody can live up to the teachings that they're trying to absorb. Some people will think first, what's in it for me? Some people will think first, I've got to get my trip together. Some people will think first, me, and be threatened by other people. And other people will think, well, what's good for everybody? How can I help other people? How can I think in terms of what's going to be helpful generally? Now you'll notice one thing. You see these people over a period of years. It's not as if they move in and then move out and you don't see them anymore. As happens with our culture, they say that the average family in America moves 16 times. Here we've seen them for 30, 34 years, some of them, quite a few of them actually. And what you see is that those who think in personal, selfish, egotistical ways don't thrive. Whereas those who think first of what's in it for everybody and how can we help and how can we give, those who live the truths that I'm talking about, they prove it in their own lives. They're happy. They're radiant. People see them and they're inspired by them. Why? Because these things work and people know it. It's just that you don't see enough examples in your own life to be able to take it seriously. Somebody says nice guys finish last and you see them getting ahead and you think, well, maybe I should just go out and cut a few throats or whatever. But bit by bit you come to understand that yes, it does work. You know, I'll give you a very funny example in a way. Many years ago I was to go to India, to Europe. This was in New York and my parents had invited me to France. I went up to the Pan Am counter. The man in front of me had a few things. He was overweight. And the check-in clerk there was saying that, I'm sorry, you're going to have to pay excess baggage. And he was furious and he was demanding to see the manager and he was saying, I know the president of this company, and all sorts of outrage that he was expressing. And the man behind the counter just got more and more rigid. The manager came out and he said, I'm sorry, sir, we can't help you. You just have to, oh, I'll never fly Pan Am again, and all the usual bluster. And he was, but he had to pay. Well, I was a little worried. I was behind him with much more than he had. I didn't have the money to pay. I said, well, God, help me out. So I came to the counter, but I came with a smile and thought of this man as my friend, not an antagonist. And he said, oh, what do you got here? Oh, okay. You know, so much can be accomplished with an attitude of goodwill. I was in a bank many years ago in Rome, and I went to the counter, to the cashier, and I said, well, I have a lot of several hundred thousand rupees, which is a few $100s, not rupees, lira. And I said, could you change them for me into dollars? Well, I'm sorry, that's too much. The regulations don't allow it. I said, well, can Italians do it? Well, yes, of course, Italians can. I said, well, you're an Italian, why don't you do it? She did. You know, when you go to people with a cheerful, friendly expectation, when you think that these people are your friends, not your enemies or your competitors, you'll be amazed at how people change. Everybody reacts to this. What you can prove with a community, however, is much stronger. Then you can no longer say, oh, but he's a certain kind of person. No, it's a principle. When people live like that, it just happens. Now, Ananda's it will fail in its mission if it doesn't convey this concept to other people. And when I say other people, I would like to say everybody. Because everybody wants to find happiness. This is the way to find it. Everybody wants to get out from pain. This is the way to do it. Find fulfillment in yourself. Find what you're looking for in yourself. Yes, it's good if you meditate. Yes, it's good if you practice yoga. Yes, if it's good if you do all these things. Most people won't do that. But most people are going to think, what's in it for me? And if they realize that there's nothing in it for them if they do it wrong, that gives them all the incentive they need to start thinking. Now, supposing Joe Crumpet and William Baker happened to have shops next door, And William Baker sees that all these people are flocking to Joe Crumpet, and very few people are coming to him. He's going to say, oh, well, maybe I should when people come. And pretty soon he begins to feel, well, gee, smiling isn't all that bad. He'll become more like Joe Crumpet. Joe Crumpet, seeing William Baker there, seeing him sour and angry and upset and selfish, will think, well, what's the matter with this poor guy? Maybe there's something wrong. Maybe I need to know something about his background, his family. He has this expansive attitude. And so he looks into it and he finds that, yes, he has a wife who's dying of some disease. He has children who are ill. One child is maybe not well mentally, whatever it is. He begins to develop compassion for him. And with that compassion, he lifts him also. Don't you see how this kind of attitude of sharing, of expansiveness, of friendship is so much more practical? And yet as you go down the history of all these different writers, Machiavelli, Adam Smith, Charles Darwin, all the idea that life is just survival of the fittest and you've got to think in terms of getting yours or you'll go under. Nonsense. When I walk down the path at Ananda, I know that there are rattlesnakes in the area. I'm not constantly, I'm not thinking about rattlesnakes for God's sake. I'm aware that they exist. I'm aware that I should sort of keep some eye out. But I'm not going to think about that all the time. We don't think about survival all the time. We think about enjoying life. That's what we're really trying to do with life. Darwin was talking about a mechanism, but that's not what really accounts for evolution. Evolution, which I've explained at some length in my book and in my other book, Out of the Labyrinth, is really an evolution of consciousness. A conscious desire to enjoy, a conscious desire to know and to relate to. This is the raising of consciousness from the level of the lowest form to the highest. You know, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Well, mollusks don't think. Mollusks. They don't think. I don't suppose they do. They don't give any evidence of thinking. You have this mollusk that you can see at the Monterey Aquarium. All it does is sort of 15 years of this moving on a rock. And finally, after 15 years, it's ground a hole deep enough in that rock to be able to nestle down and catch little plankton or whatever go by. I doubt that it's thinking very heavily. Thinking is not what determines your existence. Consciousness is. Consciousness is not a scientific phenomenon because you can't analyze it. It's with consciousness that you do the analyzing. And so consciousness has been left out of the picture when scientists talk and do their research, but it's the essence of everything. Karl Marx, with his idea, based on Freud, on Darwin, thought that the basic human being is the one who's the most animalistic. No. To love other people is not just like icing on a sundae. It's the direction. Where we're going is what we're looking for, not where we've come from. To say that we're really only monkeys, well, if you want to be honest about it, why not say that we're really only worms? Monkeys came, they say, from worms too. Worms came from mollusks. Maybe I'm only a mollusk. There is no room in modern scientific thinking for aspiration. Freud kept talking about your past. He didn't talk about what you really want. He tried to make people normal. And look around at the normal people and you think, I don't know. We need a whole new shift in consciousness. I hope that with my books and with the teachings that Yogananda has given, with the example of Ananda, I hope, but I much more than hope, I absolutely believe that people are going to get the message that there is hope for a better world, that we're living in a world that is going upward towards something much more real, much more exciting. We are living in interesting times, and that interest will be an eye-opener. It'll be wonderful.